The image of Beethoven as a revolutionary musical hero has certainly played a significant role in the popularization of his work. Even in the 21st century, this composer, born in the late 1700s, remains one of Western culture's most potent symbols of rebellious artistic individualism. But while an acquaintance with a wide swath of Beethoven's music yields an awareness of its astonishing expressive range and subtlety and the feat of intellectual brilliance it represents, a tendency to emphasize his most overtly heroic works and the mythos inspired by his dramatic life experience have created a framework for listening to his music in which a profound catharsis is a de facto expectation. This presumption of musical heroism doesn't take into account Beethoven's fundamental artistic classicism and the degree to which he was a creature of the age of reason, forming a context within which it becomes difficult to appreciate his more emotionally complex works on their own terms. In this regard, Beethoven's Eighth Symphony may be seen as a case in point. While his Fifth, Sixth, Seventh, and Ninth Symphonies all break new ground in their own unmistakable ways, the Eighth, written for the usual strings, pairs of winds plus timpani, and timing out at about 27 minutes, represents a curious return to the late Haydnesque parameters of his First Symphony. But this apparent retrenchment is only essential as a matter of scaffolding. In fact, the limited scope of what Beethoven called his Little Symphony in F major provides the work with the foundation for a mode of expression that distinguishes this symphony from all his others. From the Eighth Symphony's earliest moments, there is a sense that the 18th century garb it shares with Beethoven's First is being filled out here by a much more imposing creature. The composer's particular brand of humor, an odd mixture of Falstaffian wit and puerile delight, is present in abundance throughout the piece, and its unfiltered expression is the work's cheerful purpose. In the first movement, this is accomplished with an almost obsessive use of forceful accents, or sforzandi, on weak beats, and banal tick-tock figures for strings and individual woodwinds. A moment of particular interest is the recapitulation, where the movement's opening theme isn't given to the violins in a brilliant register as it was at the outset, but is instead assigned to the cellos, basses, and bassoons, who can hardly be heard over the triple forte howling of the rest of the orchestra. While this has often been identified as one of Beethoven's musical jokes, it's equally possible that he was simply channeling the same spirit that led Charles Ives to respond to a complaint that one of his songs called for notes far beyond the limits of the human voice by saying, "If a song wants to go there, it should." The second movement, with its implacably steady repeated notes for winds, was long thought to have been a light-hearted tribute to Beethoven's erstwhile friend Johann Nepomuk Melzel, the putative inventor of the metronome. In fact, Melzel developed his metronome almost 3 years after Beethoven wrote this symphony, and it's more likely that the movement's points of humor were meant to reside within the juxtaposition between the entirely stable wind accompaniment and the complicated, slightly erratic phrase lengths of the main tune, which is tossed back and forth between high and low strings. There are frequent outbursts of fortissimo that vanish as quickly as they appeared, and Beethoven heightens the playful atmosphere by using a medieval technique called hocket, in which a melody is passed around in such abbreviated segments that an ostensibly smooth line is rendered pointillistic and spiky, creating an effect that we more often associate with Stravinsky. The third movement is the only true minuet in a Beethoven symphony, but here the usually genteel, courtly dance is buffeted by vigorous textures and heavy, sometimes oddly placed accentuations. This minuet casts the impression of being written not for a gathering of the nobility, but rather for a band of inebriated hunters. Beethoven also indulges his propensity for broad humor by closing out the minuet section with an 8-bar passage in which the orchestra sounds as if it's lost and on the verge of falling apart, before eventually righting itself in the final measure. For pure Beethovenian-style slapstick musical comedy, the finale of the Eighth Symphony is unrivaled. The sudden fortissimo appearance of the note C-sharp, a note that's outside the scale of the movement's F major key, is the comic device that's most favored, although the prevailing sense of riot is fueled by frenetic triplet patterns and moments when the maelstrom abruptly halts, only to reveal a thoroughly silly putt-putting octave figure, played by bassoon and timpani, the drums being tuned in octaves for the first time in a symphony. The merriment reaches its high point in the coda, where the main theme, previously written in F major, unexpectedly appears out of bounds in F-sharp minor, and then seems to get caught in a loop during its final notes. Suddenly, the brass and timpani come crashing in on the note F, immediately ripping the music back into the home key. This wild, jolting effect prompts the image of a giant reaching down, grabbing a moving train, and shifting it to a parallel track without the train losing an ounce of momentum. It's an appropriately madcap gesture for the closing moments of this thoroughly unbuttoned work. Ultimately, what makes Beethoven's Eighth Symphony so fascinating is the virtuosic implementation of his mature, highly individual musical language within a formal context that harkens back to the classical models he employed during his youth. In a sense, the Eighth is a more appropriate bookend to Beethoven's First Symphony than his Ninth, which is in many respects sui generis. Less than 15 years separate the publication of the First and Eighth Symphonies, and yet during that short period, Beethoven's music evolved from the level of a supremely talented young professional to that of a transcendent artist, an evolution that is joyously demonstrated in this so-called Little Symphony in F major.